and welcome to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien, and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive online community. Our book club is currently reading through The Fall of Númenor. For the sake of this book club, I've broken The Fall of Númenor down into 10 sections, and so today we will be covering the 6th section. This video contains my notes from this section as well as any important comments brought up during our live voice chats, which have been super fun. This week we are covering the years 1000 all the way through approximately 1700. So that's quite a bit of time. Circa year 1000. Sauron, alarmed by the growing power of the Númenorians, chooses Mordor as a land to make into a stronghold. He begins the building of Barad-dûr. News of the founding of Eregion and the friendship between the dwarves and the Noldor compounded Sauron's fears regarding the Númenorians coming to Lindon. He leaves Eriador alone and goes to Mordor, as it was afterwards called, and began to build the stronghold of Barad-dûr as a counter to the Númenorian threat. It took approximately 600 years to build. Tolkien writes that he likely chose Mordor because it was geographically protected and naturally a bit horrifying to begin with. Barad-dûr suffered no rival and laughed at flattery, biding its time, secure in its pride and immeasurable strength. Year 1075. Tar-Oncalime becomes the first ruling queen of Númenor. Rule from 1075 to 1280, 205 years. Tar-Oncalime was proud and willful and did not lead a happy life. When her father passed away, she neglected his policies and gave no further aid to Middle-earth. She did not allow her son's daughters to marry, and so his son Sauron became the 9th ruler. Year 1200, Sauron endeavors to seduce the Eldar. Gil-galad refuses to treat with him, but the smiths of Eregion are won over. The Númenorians begin to make permanent havens. In this time, Sauron revealed himself in his fair form in pursuit of the Eldar. While men would be easiest to ensnare, he knew that the elves were more powerful, and so he directed his efforts at them. He was not allowed into Lindon, where Elrond and Gil-galad doubted him, though they didn't know who he was. 1280, the Second Age, Tar-Anarion becomes the 8th king of Númenor. 1394, Tar-Surion becomes the 9th king of Númenor. Circa year 1500. The elven smiths, instructed by Sauron, reached the height of their skill. They began forging the rings of power. Despite the warnings from Gil-galad and Lindon, Sauron was received in Eregion under the name Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and in this time he targeted Celebrimbor specifically. Other names mentioned in Unfinished Tales for Sauron are Artano, which means high smith, and Aulendil, which means one who is devoted to the service of Aule. Annatar suggested that they work together for the purpose of making Middle-earth blissful and beautiful, saying, "Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Erisea, nay, even as Valinor?" The restless hearts of the Noldor made them more vulnerable to Sauron's manipulations. And in this time, their knowledge increased and their skill surpassed all that they had achieved before, and they created the Rings of Power. Tolkien writes, "But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance." In letter 131, Tolkien writes, "In this time, the elves came their nearest to falling to magic and machinery." Now, the Rings of Power could prevent decay as well as enhance natural powers. They also had other powers derived from Sauron, such as rendering invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. In 1556, Tar-Talparion becomes the 10th ruler of Númenor, and Tolkien writes, "During the reign of Tar-Talparion, momentous events were to unfold in Middle-earth." In approximately 1590, the 3 rings are completed in Eregion. Sauron had success with the Noldor in Eregion, where he had posed as an emissary of the Valar. Tolkien writes, he perceived at once that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and obstacle, and he endeavored ever to placate her, bearing her scorn with outward patience and courtesy. Ultimately, Galadriel and Celeborn were expelled from Eregion between 1350 and 1400 after Sauron had conspired with Celebrimbor to do so. After this, Galadriel came to dwell in Lorinand, which is afterward called Lorien or Lothlorien, and Celeborn remained behind in Eregion, disregarded by Celebrimbor at this time. Now, Sauron left Eregion in approximately 1500 after the Rings of Power had begun to be made. So he was not actually there when the 3 rings are completed, because as we know from our lore of the Rings of Power, the 3 rings for the Elven kings were not touched by the hand of Sauron, even though they were created using his skills and knowledge that he had taught the elves. He never actually touched them. He wasn't there when the 3 were made. Circa year 1600, Sauron forges the One Ring in Orodruin. He completes Barad-dûr. Celebrimbor perceives the designs of Sauron. Tolkien writes, "Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last." Sauron could perceive and govern the thoughts of those who wore the other rings. He had been obliged to let his power pass into the ring, which was a flaw in his plan. However, the ring was essentially indestructible, and he did not sense any risk of losing it. Tolkien writes, "There was another weakness. If the One Ring was actually unmade, annihilated, and then its power would be dissolved. But so great was the ring's power of lust that anyone who used it became mastered by it. It was beyond the strength of any will, even his own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. So he thought. It was, in any case, on his finger." And it's also in this section that we learn the ring verse, the iconic poem that every Lord of the Rings fan knows. So that was fun. Celebrimbor had not been corrupted, but had been deceived because he had accepted Sauron as what he had posed to be. Now, when he discovered the existence of the One Ring, he rejected Sauron and he sought out Galadriel for counsel. The 3 elven rings should have been destroyed in this time, but Tolkien writes that they failed to find the strength, and so instead they agreed to hide them and never use them. In this time, Galadriel received Nenya, the White Ring. The other 2 rings were sent to Gil-galad in Lindon. Tolkien also pauses here for a moment to explain why the elves and the men of the West did not assault Sauron as soon as possible, writing, "It is now vain and indeed unjust to judge them foolish not to do, as in the end they were obliged to do, to have quickly gathered their forces and assailed Sauron." So they couldn't have known for certain what Sauron's intentions were initially, because until about 1600, he was still operating under the disguise of beneficent friend, and he often journeyed at will in Eriador with few attendants, and so he wouldn't risk any rumor that he was gathering armies. So a lot of people, most of the people, were unaware what his true intentions were. He also had a primary weakness, that he did not have sufficient armies to march against elves and men, and so he needed to gain his strength, which is why he posed as a friend for so long. It's also in this section that we have probably my favorite piece of Sauron trivia, in which we learned that when Sauron was obliged to wear his fair form, the orcs wouldn't listen to him. Tolkien writes, "When he was obliged for the cousining of the western men and elves to wear as fair a form and countenance as he could, they despised him and they laughed at him." So that's just hilarious to me, and I love it. I'm so thankful for Tolkien to adding that in, because it's one of my favorite little bits about Sauron. 1693, War of the Elves and Sauron begins. The 3 rings are hidden. When Sauron realizes that the elves were not deceived, he demanded the rings be returned to him and came against them in open war. However, he was not able to reclaim the 3 because they were concealed and had remained unsullied by the hand of Sauron. 1695, Sauron's forces invade Eriador. Gil-galad sends Elrond to Eregion. Sauron came against Eregion in 1695, where his forces were briefly driven back by Celeborn, and at this time Elrond was on his way, but he did not arrive before Sauron. 1697, Eregion is laid waste. Death of Celebrimbor. The gates of Moria are shut. Elrond retreats with a remnant of the Noldor and founds the refuge of Imladris. So at this point, Sauron arrived in Eregion, where Celebrimbor was taken captive. Tolkien writes, Celebrimbor, desperate, himself withstood Sauron on the steps of the great door of the Myrdain. But he was grappled and taken captive, and the house was ransacked. In this time, Sauron reclaimed the 9 and the 7 rings, but he did not find the 3. Celebrimbor was tortured, but he would not reveal the location of the 3, and he was ultimately put to death. However, even without his knowledge, Sauron deduced that the 3 must be with Galadriel and Gil-galad. Sauron bore Celebrimbor's body as a banner as he returned to battle with Elrond. Sauron's forces withdrew after being assailed by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, as well as elves from Loranand led by Amroth. 1699, Sauron overruns Eriador. In this section, we learn a little bit more about the history of Khazad-dûm via an ancient dwarvish lament about Durin, which I thought was very interesting. It's in this section that Sauron's forces are weakened, but they continue ravaging the lands. 1700. Tar Minister sends a great navy from Númenor to Lindon, and Sauron is defeated. Tolkien writes, Gil-galad and the Númenorians were holding the Lune in desperate defense of the Grey Havens, when in the very nick of time the great armament of Tar Minister came in, and Sauron's host was heavily defeated and driven back. 1701, Sauron is driven out of Eriador. Tolkien writes that Sauron was forced to return to Mordor broken and humiliated, where he vowed vengeance against Númenor. In this time, the first White Council was held, and Imladris was determined to be maintained as a stronghold. Vilya, the blue ring, was given to Elrond, and the red ring was kept by Gil-galad until it is later given to Círdan. Tolkien writes, though Galadriel deemed it her duty to remain in Middle-earth while Sauron was still unconquered, she left Loranand to dwell near the sea, and in this time she came to Imladris with Celebrian her daughter. Elrond met Celebrian and immediately loved her, though he did not tell her for quite some time. At some point later, Galadriel and Celeborn came to dwell in Belfalis, where Galadriel stayed until the middle of the Third Age. And the last part of this week's reading is 1731, Tar Minister becomes the 11th king of Númenor. Tolkien writes of him, he loved the Eldar but envied them. Now let's talk about what our book club discussed during our voice chat, because it was a very fun chat, and I really think we got a lot out of it. We did a deep dive into the creation of Mordor. What do we know about the origins of Mount Doom? Now, this was prompted by some confusion after the depiction of Orodruin's eruption in the Rings of Power TV series. So what we do know about Mount Doom, Morgoth created the volcanic mountain itself in the First Age, and it was called Orodruin, which means fiery mountain. The surrounding land was called Mordor, which means black land, before Sauron made his home there, due to the effects of the volcanic eruption scarring the earth. Melkor created Mount Doom in the First Age, and the name Mordor may have been given to the surrounding land before Sauron settled there because of its eruptions. When Sauron chose the land of Mordor as his dwelling place in the Second Age, Orodruin was the reason for his choice. He used the fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and his forging. The most famous result of his forging, and in fact the only one that we know of for sure, was the One Ring. It's also interesting to note, though we will get to it in future sections, that the mountain erupts in Second Age 3429, signaling Sauron's attack on Gondor, and it is then that it takes the name Amon Amarth, which means Mount Doom. We also discussed Annatar's seduction and his styles by proposing collaboration. His seduction of the elves was done by basically being like, hey, let's do something good together. He knows he's not going to be able to get the elves to... he knows he's not going to be like, hey, let's be evil together. That's not going to work for them. And so instead what he says is, hey, we both love Middle-earth. Let's make it great together. Let's do something good. Let's fix things together, because together we can make it even better than even as good as Eressëa or even Valinor. So he's appealing to their pride and their desire to create in Middle-earth something that's very similar to the land that they love so much, because they're also tied to Middle-earth. They love Middle-earth, which is why they chose to stay. And so Sauron knows all of this, and he's working it all into his plans. We also talked a little bit about Sauron's fair form. Annatar appeared in, quote, the fairest form that he could contrive, which almost implies that he was unable to appear completely fair. It's as fair as he could be. And this would be consistent with the suspicion with which he is met by Gil-galad, Elrond, and Galadriel. We don't really know a lot about why Galadriel scorns him or why she doesn't seem to be fully on board with his plans, and she doesn't really fully buy into the idea of Annatar, but it's possible that because he wasn't able to appear, 100% fair, that she might have kind of seen through the cracks of his disguise in a way. The power of the One Ring. The power of the One Ring lies in its power of lust specifically. Tolkien talks about that over and over and over, and we all thought that was very interesting. And it also mentions Sauron's own inability to master it. It says that Sauron was unable to harm it or to change it or to stand against the will of the ring once he made it. And I think this kind of is a reflection of Sauron's inability to master his own will. This is something that would require humility, which Sauron seems incapable of. Friendship between the dwarves and elves. The creation of the Doors of Durin occurs at some point during these years, and it marks the height of friendship between dwarves and elves. Galadriel's diplomacy in relationships with the dwarves is, I'm sure, motivated by her time as a pupil of Aule, because you have dwarves being the children of Aule, and a lot of the Noldor. All of the Noldor are favored by Aule, and a lot of them were his pupils. So you can see this relationship coming as a result of their own relationship with Aule. And then we also talked a little bit about the friendship between Celebrimbor and Narvi, which is they were like the two best friends that anyone could have. The question of when did the elves discover Annatar's identity came up. They didn't become aware of his true identity until the One Ring was made and placed upon Sauron's finger. Tolkien writes, "But the elves were not so lightly to be caught. As soon as Sauron set the One Ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and of all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings." Galadriel's suspicion of Annatar. So this whole time that he's in Eregion, she's suspicious of him, but she doesn't really seem to... Well, Tolkien doesn't really give us any information about why exactly. We talked a little bit a minute ago about how it might have been related to his fair form not being entirely fair. She might have been able to kind of see through the cracks of it. Galadriel had also spent time with Melian, as someone in our discussion pointed out, and she may have been comparing Annatar's attitudes and actions against how Melian acted, and that could have also been a source for why Galadriel distrusted Annatar. Ultimately, we don't get a ton of information about it, so it's just kind of fun to speculate. Frodo's conversation with Galadriel about the One Ring in the Fellowship of the Ring. It was mentioned in our chat that in the Mirror of Galadriel, Galadriel speaks to Frodo about the ring. Frodo asks why he cannot see and know the thoughts of the other ring-bearers, to which Galadriel responds that it's because he hasn't tried, and to try would destroy him. Tolkien writes, "I would ask one thing before we go," said Frodo, "a thing which I often meant to ask Gandalf in Rivendell. I am permitted to wear the One Ring. Why cannot I see all the others and know the thoughts of those that wear them?" "You have not tried," she said. "Only thrice you have set the ring upon your finger since you knew what you possessed. Do not try. It would destroy you. Did Gandalf tell you that the rings give power according to the measure of each possessor? Before you could use that power, you would need to become far stronger and to train your will to the domination of others. Yet even so, as a ring-bearer and as one that has borne it on finger and seen what is hidden, your sight grows keener. You have perceived my thought more clearly than many that are accounted wise. You saw the eye of him that holds the 7 and the 9. And we thought that was an interesting exposition about the power of the ring and the way that it works. So it was just kind of something interesting to bring up, and it adds to your understanding of this section. We talked about a lot in this section. There's a moment between Galadriel and Sam Gamgee that was also mentioned in the chat. Tolkien writes, "To tell you the truth, I wondered what you were talking about. I saw a star through your fingers, but if you'll pardon my speaking out, I think my master was right. I wish you'd take his ring. You'd put things to right. You'd stop them digging up the gaffer and turning him adrift. You'd make some folk pay for their dirty work." "I would," she said. "That is how it would begin. But it would not stop with that, alas. We will not speak more of it. Let us go." And so once again, this was another interesting thing to bring up when we're talking about the power of the ring, about how Galadriel would be motivated to heal things, just as Anatar had proposed, but she knows that it wouldn't stop there. So she's like, yeah, I would put things to right, but ultimately I would become even worse than things are now. As we all kind of know, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, this is kind of a theme throughout the story, but I just thought it was worth bringing up in this discussion. We also asked the question, why did Sauron need to create the One Ring in the first place? I think the simplest answer is that Tolkien writes in the Waldman letter that this is a common motive, a common theme in fairy stories. He writes, "But to achieve this, he had been obliged to let a great part of his own inherent power, a frequent and very significant motive in myth and fairy story, pass into the One Ring. While he wore it, his power on earth was actually enhanced." Rings, both as a magical and non-magical but significant item, are a core element of Tolkien's story, such as the Ring of Barahir, which is not a ring of power, but it has significance. And so when it comes down to it, rings are just a core part of this story. If you're wondering why a ring and not some kind of other object, I think it just comes down to Tolkien's preference for rings. But this ring in particular afforded Sauron a way to directly influence the wills of those that he could not bring under his dominion through simple seduction or persuasion. So you can see after he could kind of get the vibe that he wasn't going to be able to bring the Noldor under his full control, this is when he goes and he makes the ring, because he's not able to do it through subtlety, he's going to do it through force. We also talked about a comparison to Morgoth. Sauron's ring is similar to the way that Morgoth had to invest himself into the creation of Arda, but Sauron's choice was to pour his power into one small object rather than to allow it to be dispersed throughout the earth itself. Tolkien writes of Morgoth, "For as he grew in malice, and sent forth from himself the evil that he conceived in lies and creatures of wickedness, his might passed into them and was dispersed. And he himself became ever more bound to the earth, unwilling to issue forth from his dark strongholds." So this had allowed Morgoth to maintain his power, even to increase it, as it spread throughout the earth. But for Sauron, he chose a different path. Sauron poured everything into this small object. Instead of binding himself to the earth, he bound himself to the ring. And so the risk for Sauron is much higher than it is for Morgoth, because everything is, compressed into one small thing. Sauron becomes bound up in the ring, and he would be almost wholly diminished if it were destroyed, and his dominion would essentially end with the ring. For Morgoth, his discord is woven into the earth, and it will last until the world itself is unmade. So even though Morgoth has been defeated and cast into the void, the shadow of malice that he created still lingers in the earth. The physical effects of Sauron's evils still linger after his own defeat, but on a much smaller scale than Morgoth's. After the defeat of Sauron, evil, of course, still exists, but I would argue that it can be more directly attributed to Morgoth than to Sauron's legacy, because it doesn't last in the same way that Morgoth does. We also spent a little bit of time in our discussion being kind of mean to Sauron. We talked a little bit about Sauron's flaws. It was the general consensus that Sauron comes across as a pretty pathetic creature. He's insecure and he's often desperate. We see Sauron calculating a lot, but when it comes down to it, he is often forced to make rash decisions that don't end up working out that well for him. And his plans are often very high risk because of his pride and his hubris. Someone also pointed out that he's kind of like a Loki figure, where he's a trickster and he's a schemer, which is very different from Morgoth. This also brought us into our last discussion point, where we talked a lot about the Norse mythology influences that we can see in this section. I know the Tea with Tolkien community is primarily inspired by a lot of the Catholic influence of Tolkien, but we know that that's not the only influence of his life, and he's drawing a lot from Norse mythology here. We see Sauron as a Loki figure, as I just mentioned. A lot of dwarvish names come straight from Norse mythology, and we also talked about the myth of the cursed ring, which I have a link, and I'll add that to the description. It was also mentioned, according to Tolkien Gateway, that Mordor is also a name cited in some Nordic mythologies, referring to a land where its citizens practice evil without knowing it, imposed on themselves by society long created for that purpose. So there was a lot lying under the surface in terms of Norse mythology influences in this section. So I thought that was really interesting and really fun. Thank you so much for listening. This episode was a little bit longer because there was just so much to talk about. We had such a lively discussion this week, and I really, really enjoyed it. I've really appreciated hearing everyone's insight. We have such a good mix of people in our Discord, with people who have read Tolkien, a dozen times, and then you have people who are reading it for the first time. And everyone has been bringing different perspectives to the table with different questions. A lot of things are questions that I would have never thought to ask before. So I've really, really enjoyed our discussion so far. If you are interested in joining future book clubs and getting in on these discussions, you can go to teawithtolkien.com/book-club, because we are wrapping up The Fall of Númenor pretty soon, but our next book club will be beginning in June, and it's going to be another reread of The Lord of the Rings. So that should be super fun. We will pick up next week with part 7. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you are enjoying our content, and tell someone you know about Tea with Tolkien. Thanks so much.